Hi, and welcome back. This will be our penultimate class. Soon I'll have to say goodbye to this wonderful makeshift office, which is, I think, maybe twice the size of my actual office. Today we move on to interwar Poland. And this is a short, a distinct, and a really terribly exciting time. A victory of the nationalist principle, but only a partial victory, because you couldn't possibly create enough nation states in East Central Europe to satisfy everybody, nor could you have a principle in which every nationality lived in its own state. But they tried, and we'll talk about that. The fact that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the greatest perceived threats of those states, would end this period was not known. They didn't know how short it would be. And these states suffered from general economic backwardness, with a couple of exceptions, coupled with political inexperience and extreme ethnic, and I mean extreme ethnic and social diversity. Almost all of them started out as democracies, and pretty much all of them, besides Czechoslovakia, moved right, viewing the communist threat as the most precarious threat to the state. The ethnic diversity undermined the states from within, but also from without, because kin states of national minorities and superpowers were constantly threatening their survival. For Jews, this is a rehearsal or a dawn of the Holocaust on one hand, thinking teleologically. On the edge of destruction, as one historian described it. Relations between Jews and non-Jews were terrible almost everywhere. Again, Czechoslovakia, a notable exception. Hungary actually revoked their emancipation, and Poland sort of got around the emancipation without formally revoking it. But it was also the culmination of national, political, and cultural life on the other hand. And this is the story we're going to be telling, right? That on the one hand, you have this tremendous oppression as emancipation is overrun and undermined. On the other hand, the culmination of national, political, and cultural life. And note also, there was a tremendous diversity of Jewish life within Eastern Europe and within the states. And for us, Poland will in many ways serve as a paradigm of the interwar East Central European experience for a few reasons. First of all, Poland has the largest Jewish population in East Central Europe and non-communist Europe, and the most highly concentrated outside of Palestine. About 3 million Jews lived in interwar Poland, something like 10% or 11% of the population, but they were much more present than that because they were nearly a third of the overall urban population, over a half of the urban population in the eastern borderland cities like Grodno and Pinsk, the area known as the Kresy. So this is a tremendously present population. The vast majority of them still involved in commerce and in industry, mostly lower middle class and proletariat, so the artisan proletariat, with a small but important professional class and wealthy bourgeoisie. And actually, there are 3 or 4 different Polish Jewries having lived under vastly different political and economic conditions for 150 years, and that really affected them. Galicia, on the one hand, had their own particular characteristics. You have a sort of Western-type Jewry in Posen, having lived under Prussia. You have Congress Poland, and then you have the Litvaks living in the Kresy. These are all Eastern-type Jews, right? Yiddish-speaking, largely traditional, in many areas strongly Hasidic and so on, but very different relationships with Polishness. Galicia, we've already spoken about. Congress Poland, obviously much more connected to Polishness than, say, out in the Kresy, which was really Russian more than Polish. Like all of East Central Europe, Poland was a successful state coming out of the fallen empires after World War I. It was really the cause célèbre of the Allies. They really hoped that a reconstituted Poland would serve as the cornerstone of new independent East Central Europe. Unlike other East European nations, Poland was not a peasant nation, so to speak, even though most of the population may have been peasants, but Poland has a long history of independence. They enjoy a significant middle class, flourishing cultural institutions, universities, and so on. It was established on the basis of Polish nationhood, integral nationalism, meaning national identity would be the social cement. They dreamed of assimilating minorities, although Dmowski, who we've spoken about once before, I believe, Dmowski vehemently opposed any notion that Jews could be assimilated into the Polish nation. Others were more generous, said that yes, they could as long as they assimilated. That would be a precondition to their equality. But the problem with this idea of Polish nationhood, of Polishness as the cement of society, is that over 30% of the population wasn't Polish. Ukrainians, above all, of course, in Galicia, also Jews, to the extent that Jews are not Polish, and we'll speak about that, Belarusians, Germans, Lithuanians, and so on. This is a real problem at the Paris Peace Conference when they're trying to rebuild the map of East Central Europe. And Jews should be seen as part of this broader Polish problem of national minorities. And really, from a practical perspective, others were far more threatening because of kin states, because they had a state nearby or on the border that wanted to defend them. That was much more. Jews have no kin state that can threaten them, although they seemed more threatening culturally because they were so anomalous culturally and economically. There were national minority rights provisions, treaties, that all of these states had to sign. And in the case of Poland, it was actually written into the Polish constitution, forced upon them in 1919, and then they become a model for Czechoslovakia, for Romania and Greece and others. So actually Poland is literally a paradigm for East Central Europe in that regard. And just, I'm not going to go through all of them. Protection of religious freedom. You couldn't be denied your Polish citizenship because of race or religion. You had the right to public primary schools in your native language and so on. And actually unique to Poland, there were articles that specifically defended Jewish rights. So for example, you couldn't hold a national election on a Saturday, which would potentially disenfranchise many, many religious Jews. Every citizen possessed the right of safeguarding his nationality and cultivating his national language and customs. That was written into the Constitution. That's the ikar, that's the main thing of national minority rights. And ultimately, it didn't work. Polish democracy is going to be sacrificed for Polish nationalism. The national minority rights provisions are a dead letter. Poland will subvert the letter of the law and the actual intention. There's really no way to enforce it. The League of Nations didn't have a mechanism that could have possibly enforced this. So the story we're going to see, again, is that life is going to be pretty rough for individual Jews. Poverty, discrimination, and so on, but amazingly rich for Jewish political and cultural life as never before. So in other words, and we'll come back to this at the end, it's going to be the exact flip of what we saw last time. In the Soviet Union, we saw individual Jews assimilating and achieving incredible social economic transformation and heights that they never had before in Russian Empire. But Jewish national culture is going to be completely suppressed by the late 30s. Here, it's the exact opposite. As always, here's an overview of where we're going. First, we'll speak for a little bit about economic development, national life, and so on. Then we'll look in detail at Jewish political life. First, we'll survey some of the major parties, and then see how those parties acted to defend Jews, what kind of strategies they employed and how they worked out. Finally, we'll talk about Jewish culture and what happens in the late 30s just on the edge of the war. Look at the periodization now in front of you. This is one way of sort of getting our hands around the period. 1919 to 1926, there's a period of sort of shaky coalitions in which Dmowski, this anti-Semitic right-wing nationalist figure, was quite dominant. He's overthrown by a coup d'etat by Pilsudski, who was a socialist at one time. He's going to have a sort of an authoritarian government from 26 to 35. When he dies, there'll be a collection of colonels who run the country as a dictatorship. Poland is on, looking at the first period first, Poland's on the edge of bankruptcy from the beginning, from 1919. It never really stabilizes as an independent state. It loses access to markets that it enjoyed before the war. It had been exporting goods to the east, but now the Russian Revolution cuts this off. High tariff barriers means closed markets to the west and the north. Germany, Austria, places it used to have access to. And this really results in the collapse of Polish industry, especially the textile trade, which is so important to Poland, and of agricultural prices. Declining industry and agriculture means high unemployment and spiraling economic problems. And in terms of Polish nationalism, Jews are really going to be seen as the enemies of Polish nationalism and Polish national aspirations. This is not always the case. This is new. From 1700s, from the time of the partitions until really the middle of the 19th century, Polish nationalism had room for Jews. Poles and Jews fought the Russians together, for example, most famously in the 1863 uprising. Jews, as we saw in Galicia, were supporting the Polish uprising in 46. They supported the Polish cause in 48. In West Galicia and in Congress Poland, there's a growing Polonization of Jewish intellectuals. And even in East Galicia, and among the young people in the late 1800s, a growing Polonization. At the end of the 19th century, this is beginning to fail. Part of the rise of the story of political anti-Semitism across Central and Eastern Europe. Unlike in Hungary, where Jews are encouraged to Magyarize and become Hungarian, Polish nationalists come to view the Jews as enemies, not allies, as I think I quoted Brian Porter's famous book, When Nationalism Began to Hate. Polish nationalism began to hate in that sense. And this is partly because Poland had such international support among the Allies. They didn't really need Jewish support for the state. That was going to happen anyway. The National Democratic Party under Dmowski really, I think, is a Polish parallel to the anti-Semitic parties of Germany and Austria of the 1870s and 1880s. It binds together social classes that have competing interests that should not be bound together in a single party from a class perspective, and it uses anti-Semitism to transcend those social divisions. This political anti-Semitic tradition carries over into the independent Poland. And I'll give you a few examples of early anti-Semitism. So, for example, independent Poland during the Russian Civil War, we know this already, that Polish troops are targeting Jewish villages for pogroms and military action. Thousands of Jews are perishing in these attacks alone. Sometimes Jews are accused of treason, but often Jews are simply caught between competing nationalist armies, Poles and Lithuanians fighting over Vilna. What are Jews supposed to do? Poles and Ukrainians in Galicia, we already spoke about. Poles and Russians in the Civil War. And when Jews volunteer, when Jews actually choose the Polish side and volunteer, they're often separated and treated as traitors when they're trying to actually just join the Polish army. 1919 independence celebrations, we know this, were involving pogroms, mostly by soldiers, Jews being dragged off trains and beaten naked, a lot of property stolen and so on. And this is rationalized because Versailles, right, the peace treaties forced the national minority rights provisions on the Polish government. And because of, on the other hand, Jewish connection to Bolshevism. So notice that Jews are on both sides. Jews are to blame for the national minority rights treaties that President Wilson and the Western powers forced on Poland, and they're to blame for the Bolshevik threat coming from the East. The economic policy of the new Polish state was Poland for the Poles. Jews are seen as an obstacle to Polish economic development, and the policy of the government was based on the primacy of nationalism. Remember, Jews are highly urbanized and highly disproportionate in commerce. Warsaw and Łódź were more than 30% Jewish, while less developed Pinsk was 63% Jewish, and Białystok, I think, was 70-some% Jewish. Peasants see employed Jews when they get to the cities and resent it. And throughout the interwar period, legislation is passed to exclude Jews from the economy. So, for example, civil service positions are restricted. The Polish bureaucracy is basically Jew-free. Less than 3% of teachers are Jewish. Jewish professors are virtually unknown, and universities are restricting Jewish enrollment from 24.6% in 1921-22 to 8.2% by 1938-39. And overall in the 30s, Jews constitute less than 1% of the civil service. It should have been much higher. It should have been higher than the percentage of 10-11% in the country because they were so urbanized and so educated, and they were less than 1%. So number one, the civil service was restricted. Number two, there was expropriation via nationalizing industries that Jews used to dominate. So for example, in 1925, the tobacco industry is nationalized, and voila, it just happens to be that Jews are dominant in the tobacco industry. And there are other business impediments thrown their way as well. Jews couldn't easily get loans, they couldn't easily get artisan licenses and so on. And the livelihood of Jewish artisans in general is jeopardized by government-sponsored cooperatives and then harassed by legal restrictions and special examinations and so on. By the 1930s, the rate of unemployment among Jewish artisans was so high that many were reduced to living on a few pennies a day, a huge percentage of the population. And the Sunday work law, which is sort of a victory of Polish labor, is obviously disastrous for Jews who also don't work on Saturday. In fact, even Jews willing to work in factories on Saturday are kept out by Polish trade unions who threaten to strike if they introduce Jewish workers. Even some Jewish-owned textile factories in Łódź wouldn't hire Jews because of the power of those Polish unions. And boycotts and pickets before Jewish stores admonishing Poles not to buy from Jews were an almost constant phenomenon in the larger cities and even in some of the smaller ones. And boycotts, by the way, are quite openly supported by the government, especially after 36, as well as by the Catholic Church with the official blessing of the primate Cardinal Lund. Jewish economy deteriorates quickly. So in Warsaw, for example, by 1925, of 2,800 shoemakers that had been there before, 2,000 were closed. Of 3,000 tailors, 2,500 were closed. Of 180 embroiderers, 108 were closed. There's a pauperization of the Jewish community that is resulting. Pilsudski, when he comes to power in 26, ends the official anti-Semitism, but he doesn't really alter the situation for the better because the worldwide depression hits in 29. And besides, despite his socialist roots, his dictatorship was not much less repressive than before. And when he dies and this group of colonels takes power, they renew a policy of official anti-Semitism modeled on Hitler's measures. Pursue economic struggle by all means, but without force. So this means measures to outlaw kosher slaughter. This means separation in universities, separating Jews in universities and lowering their numbers. This battle, by the way, had already begun from the students themselves in the 20s, but now picks up pace in the 1930s, carried out with sticks, knives, and revolvers, no less. And it was the students who forced the universities to make the famous ghetto benches that Jews had to sit at. Boycotts. The prime minister in the 30s declared from Parliament podium in 36 that he viewed boycotts, quote, with pleasure. By the end of the period, 38, 39, on the eve of the war, the rhetoric of the government was that Jews needed to be expelled and their property expropriated. Ultimately, the Jews of the new Polish state were viewed not only as strangers, although Jews had been there for almost 1,000 years and had been part of the landscape and topography for all that time, quite very much a part of the country, but rather they were viewed as an obstacle to the country's economic and spiritual development overall. And we'll come back to speak a little bit more about Polish anti-Semitism at the end of class, but we want to flip now to the Jewish side. This is what's happening to the Jews. What are the Jews doing in response? So while all of this is happening, Jewish life in a national cultural sense is flourishing and is politicized to an extent unparalleled in Europe, unparalleled in history outside of Israel, really. Despite the growing Polonization, most Jews remained unassimilated, Yiddish-speaking, Eastern-type Jews. Yes, there are regional differences. We'll see the most Polonization in Galicia, of course. But even still, in the 1921 census, 75% of Jews declared themselves Jews by nationality. In the 1931 census, they don't ask the question of nationality, they ask about language. But 80% of Jews, this is in 31, 80% of Jews still declared Yiddish their mother tongue. And many Polish-speaking Jews, many Jews who declared Polish their mother tongue, still had a nationalist identity. The Zionists in Galicia and elsewhere began from assimilated or acculturated groups. The first Zionist periodicals in Galicia were in Polish. So many of these Polish-speaking Jews, beyond the 80% of Yiddish speakers, many Polish-speaking Jews, too, had a Jewish national identity. This is a different population than we've seen anywhere else. And Jews are going to organize their political life, their own political life, and look inward in really unprecedented ways. Mass political movements are going to emerge in a really exciting way. So let's look at a few of them. Zionism. Zionism becomes a true political force, a mass movement. The most important Jewish party in Poland into the late 1930s, when economic catastrophe brings the Bund to overtake them. This might have happened in Russia as well, almost certainly would have happened in Russia as well, if not for the Soviet suppression. And Zionism includes a wide variety. It's a very heterogeneous movement. It means the socialists, like Pol Zion, Tzirei Zion, the Youth of Zion, which is a radical but not socialist group, the mainstream general Zionists, some Hebraists, some secular, the Mizrahi, which are Hebraist and religious, and more, many, many more. There are 400,000 shekels raised in 1921. The shekel was the basic unit of dues to declare yourself a member of the Zionist organization. 400,000 raised in 1921. And there is going to be, as we'll see, a split in the Zionist movement between the Galician school, which favors compromise, flexibility, cooperation with the government, because that was their experience in the Austrian setting, and the Russian sort of Congress Poland school of Zionists who refuse to do business with anti-Semites, and they seek other ways to force the regime to bend to its will. We'll see that more in a few minutes. The Bund also emerges, eventually becomes the most successful Jewish party over the Zionists in the late 30s, initially in the 20s, still quite weak. It could really only appeal to the secular, anti-religious, anti-clerical element, and to those who really sympathize strongly with its class approach to the Jewish question. Polish Jewry was overwhelmingly religious, and in the 1920s, still lower middle class and independent. Pauperization in the 30s will be key to the growth of the Bund. Pauperization will strengthen the Bund. Lower middle class, independent artisans, for example, and shopkeepers tend not to support the Bund. They still see themselves as being middle class and not workers. The Bund will be strongest in the trade unions, although it never really effectively ameliorates the Jewish working class condition. Not that they had much chance. The Aguda, Agudas Yisrael, also emerges now, the political party of Orthodox Jews. This is mostly the Hasidic element in Congress Poland is supporting this. It's the Gera Rebbe, who's the most important of the Congress Poland Hasidic groups just outside of Warsaw. The Belzer Rebbe, he was, if you recall, the key backer of Machzikei Adas decades earlier in Galicia. The Belzer Rebbe refuses to endorse Agudas Yisrael, so it remained quite weak in Galicia, despite the strength of Hasidic movement and the early foundation of politicized orthodoxy there. And Hasidism in general is somewhat weak in the crest in the eastern borderlands, so the Aguda remains quite weak there as well. Orthodox had to be political to defend their interests and positions, right? And the Aguda is going to demand religious autonomy, which actually Poland and other East European governments are pretty willing to grant, and actually that's why they tend to find themselves allies with Polish nationalists. In return for that political support, the Aguda is going to receive a number of important concessions, especially recognition of its religious schools as satisfying the requirements for the Compulsory Education Act and government support of the Aguda, of Aguda control in the Kehilas. We saw this before, actually, this paradoxical situation where politicized Orthodox Jews support the Polish government of the Polish those in power in exchange for not actually having to become Polish. Throughout the Pilsudski era, there really is no effort made to curtail Jewish religious freedom, just like there's not much effort to curtail Jewish cultural freedom. So that's going to remain quite strong. The Aguda claims to be the voice of the so-called silent majority, but when election results kind of belie that, then they claim, okay, we're maybe not the silent majority, but we are the voice of quality, if not quantity. But they do pretty well in the ballots, especially in Jewish community elections. And we'll come back to the elections a little bit later. The Aguda is the last sector of Jews to organize politically in Poland. Generally speaking, Orthodox are among the last to organize, and thus the forms of organization, the rhetoric of politics, the ways of influencing Jewish opinion had already been set. I say generally because we've seen the great exception that in Galicia, the birth of modern Jewish politics comes from the liberals and the Orthodox, but not here. In fact, the founders of the Aguda are including some former religious Zionists who had become dismayed by the direction of Zionist movement and now left Zionism and joined the Aguda. So even though it presents itself in stark relief against the Zionists and the Bundists, it also copies both consciously and unconsciously those parties' political programs. A few examples. The model for the Knessia Gedola, which is the great assembly of Aguda of Torah sages, the assembly of Torah sages, the World Aguda Conference, the model was the Zionist Congress. They admit this. This is not somehow unself-conscious. They're quite aware of this. The organizational framework with a central office and notions of membership, this comes as well from that. The notion of a party daily newspaper, the Ger Rebbe, like the Belzer Rebbe half a century earlier, the Ger Rebbe was key in the foundation of a daily newspaper. The Machzikei Adas was not daily. This is a daily newspaper which was endorsed as a religious good. You should read it on Shabbat. It's endorsed dafka on Shabbat. Youth movements, again, copying the other parties, having youth movements. And above all, I mean, the Aguda had to accept the rules of the game that were set by the nationalists. So they had to speak, for example, of the Jews as a national group. If you want to have legitimacy and you want to be competitive on the Jewish street, you have to speak of the Jews as a national group. They would say, well, but yes, it's different because our nation is based on Torah. Not sure what that means in a secularized world. There was sort of an icing on the cake for covering up a lipstick on a pig, whatever they say. But it was a nation. You had to speak of it as a nation. They mimic Zionist appeals of unity and Zionist attempts to reach the masses. And they even attempt to establish a competing organization to the Jewish National Fund to buy land in Israel. Once you have Balfour Declaration, the appeal of buying land and developing land in Palestine was quite strong. So they develop a competing organization to buy land in Palestine. And they're actually in general more worried about the Zionists than they are about the Bundists. I mean, the Bundists were militantly and outspokenly secular and anti-clerical. Everyone knew where they stood, but Zionism hijacks and transforms traditional Jewish symbols, rhetoric, and texts in a fashion that appealed to many traditional, not yet Orthodox Jews. We saw examples of that a few classes ago when we talked about Zionism, how they take Jewish symbols, Jewish ideas, Jewish holidays, and they present themselves as being the most authentic expression of Judaism. They are rarely militantly anti-clerical. And so that was much more appealing to traditional Jews than Bund. And so that was the greater concern of the Aguda. There are other nationalist parties and movements as well. The Volkspartei, which is a Yiddishist, diaspora-oriented nationalist movement, strongly anti-Zionist and anti-socialist. It doesn't, even though Zionism basically hijacks their agenda. Zionism is basically going to be advocating diaspora Jewish nationalism. It has been in Galicia since the 1880s. But the Volkspartei itself never achieves much success in interwar Poland. And Zionist revisionism, led by Vladimir Jabotinsky, a right-wing Zionism adapted from right-wing Polish parties, advocating maximum territory in Palestine, but above all, advocating a vigilant militarism, a militaristic identity. Zionism as identity is most important, and in this case, it's one of a militant identity. And this, by the way, the spread we just went over parallels political life in Israel for its first 40 years, and in some ways until today. The first decades of Israeli political life are essentially a continuation of Polish interwar politics, just as Hebrew culture in Israel can't be understood outside the history of Hebrew and Yiddish culture in Eastern and East Central Europe before the war. Jewish divisiveness is absolutely incredible. Even without a landed gentry or peasantry, which are two traditional sources of political parties, they have this tremendous divisiveness. But the central questions of Jewish identity, language, location, the role of religion, these are not dividing other national movements. And anyway, since the Jews have no real power, there was very little incentive to unite. Jewish political activism was also incredible. A tremendous economic upheavals, the rise of antisemitism pushed Jewish youth into political parties, undermining parental authority and increasing the generation gap. We saw that generation gap happening in the Soviet Union, but here it's different because here it's pushing Jews not only into assimilationism, we'll see that too, but especially into this vibrant Jewish national life. These parties started taking on state-like functions like schools and camps. They become self-contained political lives for the members of each party, youth groups and clubs and so on. Each political group becomes a movement, a self-contained political and cultural life forged against a hostile majority, a hostile broader society. And the parties are especially successful at giving the youth an identity and a life in an environment that seemed to them that had no future. Their technical goals might have failed, as we'll see, but they give them a life and an identity. Economic hopelessness and decline and so on is the context. And these ideologies reconnected Jewish youth to the world. And by the way, we know quite a bit about them, in part because there was a contest, an autobiography contest, led by the group Yiva. We'll speak about them a little bit later, in 32, 34, and 39, that asked young people to submit their stories. Rather than paying them to get them, they had a contest where the winners would get a certain cash prize. They collected these. Many were lost in the Holocaust, but many survived. And actually, they've been translated. You can go read them in English. And it's really quite interesting. For many of these young Jews, politics doesn't define their lives per se. They're not ideologues. Many are jumping from group to group. And it wasn't because they were trying to make up their mind per se. It was the new cultural world they longed for. They weren't devoted ideologues because they were convinced by the logic of one party or another. And actually, many of them might have jumped because there was a cute boy or girl in the other group, or they had better food or something very mundane like that. It was the cultural world they longed for more than any kind of ideological commitment per se. No single Jewish party achieved hegemony on the Jewish street in Poland. And there was a division of success between Zionists who tended to do better in the parliamentary election, and Bundists who tended to do better in municipal elections and in unions, and the Aguda, which does better at the community level, which suggests very sophisticated Polish Jewish identities. The same Jews are voting for all three parties depending on the context. How did they work? How did they actually try to fight this desperate situation? There's a paradoxical situation going on here, right? The Jewish community is deeply rooted in traditional life, but is undergoing a process of modernization, which makes it pretty conducive to political and mobilization. The vast majority of Jews remain unassimilated under a regime that tolerates a wide range of cultural and political expression, unlike in the Soviet Union. and becomes, therefore, the center of autonomous Jewish cultural and political life in this unprecedented and really never, ever to be repeated way. So in this sense, it's preferred to the Russian Jewish, the Soviet Jewish situation. Dynamic, exciting times with many, many new ways of being Jewish and many ways of taking part in the broader society. And these movements penetrate deeply into the Jewish population. The Aguda, as much as the Zionists, the Bund, other key agents of modernization. They have to deal with the situation of virulent and all-pervasive anti-Semitism. The independence is accompanied by pogroms, anti-Jewish terror, then a state campaign to Polonize Poland, weaken the already shaky Jewish economic structure. You combine that with a weak economy and rising non-Jewish competition. This is a devastated Jewish population, especially the youth, and especially in the 1930s as anti-Semitism explodes, influenced by the Nazi example. In that regard, the Soviet Union obviously is better, at least the individuals did better. And this is the critical issue of material existence. This poses the greatest problem to Polish Jewish political factions, which in this democratic era takes over community leadership, right? They all face the same problem. How can the Jewish minority, just 10% of the population, lacking foreign protection, how can they hope to reverse the policies of the Polish government and protect the interests of Poland's 3 million Jews? How can they do it? What strategies will work? And again, an immense variety of Jewish political parties, incredible factionalism, left Polei Zion. Polei Zion is just one of the the socialist Zionist factions. And there's left Polei Zion and right Polei Zion of Eastern Galicia only. There's right Polei Zion in Congress Poland, the Tzirei Zion, Hitachdut, Dror. These are all policies only of the Zionist left, and many other forms of Zionism, general Zionism, Hashomer Tzair, Mizrahi, the Bund, the Aguda, the Volkspartei, Revisionism. And these are just the Jewish parties. Also, there are attraction of Jews to general movements like communism. So what we're going to do now is survey the three largest groups, the general Zionists, the Aguda, and the Bund, to see their different strategies for confronting this material challenge and how it worked out for them. So let's start with the Zionists. The Zionists want to repudiate the old politics of Stadtlanut. This means accommodation and representation by an intercessor, right? They want a new politics, aggressive militancy, pushy representation. Jewish politics in this new key, right? Heroically opposing anti-Semitism in parliament, for example. Well, they had the first chance in 1919. There were the elections to the first Polish parliament. Already December of 1918, they had this Jewish preliminary conference. 498 delegates come from 144 cities and towns. They resolved to form a Jewish National Congress, and they form, at least right now, a temporary Jewish National Council backed by all of the Zionists and even some Orthodox, mainly the religious Zionist Orthodox. The non-Zionist left, even the Volkspartei and most Orthodox ban it. This is to be expected. This is the story we're going to see. I'm reminded very much, if you haven't seen it, of the movie Life of Brian, with all of this sort of bickering over nuances and the total failure to unite. We're going to see that narrative as we go through the whole 20 years. In any event, the Zionists launched a major political campaign with its own slate in all the electoral districts, but the other parties, the Orthodox, the Focus, even Polei Zion and the Bund, they all run their own candidates. And this internal division, coupled with discriminatory electoral law, which is sort of discouraging national minorities, undermines their representation. Just 3% of the seats in parliament went to Jews, even though they were 11% of the population. 11 deputies are elected, 6 from the Jewish National Council, which sort of proves that a majority of Jews are faithful to national ideas. Every political group, except for the assimilationists, at this point are demanding recognition of the Jews as a national group and national rights, which they had, obviously, in the Constitution. This is opposed by all Polish parties. The PPS, by the way, the Polish Socialists, as much as the right, maybe even more so. The PPS, the Polish Socialists had always been, this was true of the PPSD in Galicia as well, the Polish Socialists had always been assimilationist in the sense of demanding Jewish to become Poles, but especially now, when they're fending off attacks from the right, they are going to double down on that ideology. During the 1920s, the general Zionists are the strongest single Zionist bloc and the strongest political force within Polish Jewry. They very much see themselves as being Jewish leaders, not just Zionist leaders, not just leaders of the Zionists, but leaders of all Jews. They are the natural leaders. Others are assimilationists, even if they're not assimilationists. They're assimilationists. They're traitors. the way your crazy left-wing roommate in college called anybody to the right of a socialist a fascist. They're all fascists. Doesn't make a difference. So for the Zionists, they're all assimilationists. It doesn't matter. If they're not Zionists, they're assimilationists. And they see themselves as the natural Jewish leaders, and they're very much engaged in what is known in German as Landespolitik, diaspora politics, or sometimes known as Gegenwartsarbeit, work in the present. Palestine someday will deal with that. Right now, we have to work in the present to protect the Jews living in the diaspora while preparing them, to be sure, for eventually going to Palestine. They have a strategy of forming a minorities bloc. And this is how it comes about. They recognize the failures of the 1919 elections, followed immediately by those bloody pogroms, right, especially in Galicia, and they attempt to organize a coalition of minority nationalities within Polish parliament to enforce national minority rights, to turn Poland into a true state of its nationalities. They oppose the anti-Semitic coalition government, as does the main German party. By the way, actually, this idea of a minorities bloc was suggested by the main German deputy. And Grimbaum, a general Zionist, helps forge this minorities bloc, try to enforce the national minority rights provisions of the treaties and of the Constitution. And it's organized around the 1922 election. It's a temporary success. The Jews win 17 seats on the national minorities slate, plus 15 more from Galicia. The Galicians, as we'll see in a second, don't join the national minorities bloc. And 2 more in Western Galicia, which also don't join the national minorities bloc. Periodization 1-0, the Bund 1-0, the Focus, God bless them, managed to win 1 seat. Jewish members form a Jewish club in the parliament to present a united front, about 34 members altogether. Now, the Galician Zionists refused to join the bloc because they drew their support from among Polonized Jews, in part, and also in part because they felt that working with territorialist minorities was pointless. Many of those, if not all of those nationalities, Ukrainians, chief among them, wanted territorial concessions, but the Jews support a strong Poland. These Galician Zionists also feared it would deepen Polish anti-Semitic feelings, something they knew quite well from when Poles accused Galician Jews of supporting the Ukrainians. As one of these Zionists put it from Galicia, the nationalities bloc will call forth a frontal opposition against us on the part of the entire Polish people, and will lose even the relatively friendly groups among the Poles, especially the Polish Socialist Party. And anyway, there's a Galician tradition of working with the authorities in opposition to the Russian Zionist militancy. The bloc remains until 1927, but never really overcomes Polish parliamentary obstacles. Ultimately has very little effect. It accomplishes basically nothing. The Poles railed against the minorities just as the Galician Zionists feared they would. When the Jewish Club gave a pivotal vote in the first in one of the first actions of Parliament, electing a left-wing speaker, the right wing went crazy about how non-Poles are determining Polish policy and fate. He was assassinated 7 days later, and a more centrist figure, again with the key votes of the Jewish delegates, replaced him. In any event, the parliament was growing less and less important as a factor in political life in any event down the road. In 1928, the Jewish parties are splitting, neutralizing their effect, and they win less than half the delegates. They slide from 46 to 22 delegates. The Galician Zionists supported instead an alternative strategy of working with the anti-Semitic government. The government also wants a deal. They want to tout to the world and to win American loans, how great they are. And so 2 important Galician Zionists, already from before the First World War, Osias Thon and Leon Reich, they form an agreement, an ugoda, after 7 months of negotiation in 1925. The Jewish side commits itself to support the inviolability of the Polish frontiers and the international policies of the Polish state, to oppose the minority bloc in all of their tactics, and basically writes a blank check to support the Polish government. The government, in turn, gives almost nothing. A series of very small concessions, very few of which they were made public at the time. For example, kosher kitchens for Jewish soldiers, or not forcing Jewish students in state schools to write on the Sabbath. But these concessions, few to begin with, were not honored. And the Galician Zionists were attacked in Jewish polemics for what was portrayed as a cowardly sellout. There was a bankruptcy here of Zionist rhetoric in the face of Polish reality. Neither of them could accomplish anything. Galicians pledged Jewish support for an openly anti-Semitic government in return for vague promises with no guarantee for fulfillment. And it was so desperate, even some Congress Poland Zionists supported the Agoda after it was signed. Not Grimbaum, of course, but others did. It shows the difficult position they're in. What the hell are they supposed to do? They just don't know what to do. The minorities bloc had failed. They thought maybe the government would tone down its anti-Semitism for its own reasons. But ultimately, the Agoda and the bloc failed. Zionists during the 1930s basically abandoned Gegenwartsarbeit, and they start pushing immigration and hachshara, right, preparing Jews for immigration to Palestine. How about the Aguda? Well, the Aguda is dedicated to conservation of traditional Judaism based on the Hasidic dynasties of Central Poland, especially Ger. The Zionists are the principal enemy. They support Stadtlanut as the ideal form of politics, right? The idealized Stadtland, the interest of the lobbyist, backdoor lobbyist. He's religious, he's frum, he's a scholar, he's removed from self-interest, well-connected, humble among the Polish politicians, and so on. From the outset, they announced their loyalty to the state and the support for Polish political goals. That's quite traditional for the Orthodox side. In the early 1920s, they basically support loyalty to the state combined with behind-the-scenes efforts to try to win favors, try to stem the anti-Semitic tide. It was briefly abandoned in 22. They actually joined the minorities blocs extremely reluctantly. They emphasized it was only for tactical reasons. It wasn't an ideological change. It was a technical device to increase Orthodox representation in the parliament and not leave it to the Zionists. They assured the Orthodox voters that no pact had been made with the anti-Semitic Ukrainians or with the White Russians. They assured the Poles that, the Aguda, our traditional pro-Polish sympathies remain intact. It keeps expressing being pushed into the bloc, begging the Poles to understand, well, with that kind of rhetoric, with that kind of understanding, obviously the alliance with the Zionists and the minority bloc could hardly last. And immediately after the election, the party reverts to its past form, attacks Grimbaum's irresponsible politics, and again seeks accommodation with the regime. And after 26, when the coup happens and Pilsudski takes over, they back out of the minority bloc and unite with the government. Pilsudski was a non-party man. He had a left-wing past, and no really overt anti-Semitism, and they felt that he might stand up to the anti-Semitic right. He was a strong man who promised law and order, an end to the political and economic chaos. The Aguda, anyway, they have no special commitment to parliamentary democracy. Overthrowing it's not a problem. And then this alliance is cemented in 28 when one of its leading politicians of the Aguda was elected to the parliament on the government list, on the Pilsudski list. Socially conservative, anti-nationalist Aguda was preferred by the Pilsudski regime. They liked the Aguda. And in turn, they gave the Aguda at least two benefits, at least briefly. First of all, it qualified the religious schools fulfilling state requirements as long as some secular school subjects were offered in Polish language. Some. How much is another question, but some. And in some cases, the Aguda schools were actually clearly favored by the government over other types of Jewish schools that we'll talk about in a few minutes. And second of all, the government tries to ensure Aguda's control over the kehillas by preventing its secularization through government control of kehillah budgets, which were being geared more towards religious institutions than the secular Jewish ones. And by the way, the coup d'etat of Pilsudski is backed by most Jews. They assume he's a socialist. It would be good for them. As a socialist, as an opponent of anti-Semitism, ultimately, unfortunately, Pilsudski recognizes his right-wing opposition, and the government becomes anything but socialist and fair. Now, here's the key point about the Aguda, though. Its agreement was at first more successful, at least from its perspective. The Aguda's perspective was more successful than the two Zionist efforts. But ultimately, it too failed. The government began to stop funding religious education, and by the early 30s, the Aguda schools are facing tremendous economic crisis. They refused to repeal the compulsory Sunday rest law, which hits the Orthodox harder than anybody. Discrimination in employment rises. Tax burden on Polish Jewry is not alleviated. The Aguda continues to back the government because they imagine, well, any other government's going to be worse, and at least this one assures law and order. And this lasts all the way until 1935, when again the regime's anti-Semitism broke down the alliance. Even before that, there were some voices in the Aguda looking towards emigration to Palestine, despite their anti-Semitism. But the real breaks happens in 36. The government restricts Jewish ritual slaughter, kosher meat, after a series of pogroms that year in 36, which actually led the Aguda to support some Bund-led strikes against anti-Semitism. My friends, if the Aguda is joining with the Bund on anything, you know things have gotten quite dire. And ultimately, the Aguda's agreement was based on the same false assumption as the Galician Zionists, that the government wants to come to some sort of agreement with its Jewish citizens. And that simply wasn't true. They really didn't. They didn't want them and they didn't need them. What about the Bund, just very briefly? The Bund is also aggressively activist. The heroic struggle of brave defenses against anti-Semitic hooligans and so on. It's a Marxist group, but favorable to secular Jewish nationalism, right, based on the Yiddish-speaking masses. We've seen this before. Strongly anti-Zionist. It was naturally contemptuous of both the Zionist and the Aguda policies. Now, socialist doctrine forbade any cooperation with the bourgeois governments. Anyway, the failure of the Bund to elect a single deputy to the parliament meant they were never attempted to do that. The nationalities bloc regarded as a coalition of chauvinistic nationalists. The Aguda was selling out to Polish reactionary groups. There was only one solution. Of course, revolution. Revolution. And revolution needs to be carried out with socialist allies. But relations between Polish socialists and the Bund, which were unfriendly in pre-war times because of Polish socialist opposition to Jewish nationalism, remains hostile now. The PPS opposes manifestations of Jewish nationalism within the Bund, and especially to the Jewish workers' use of Yiddish. The language issue basically killed Bundist hopes for united Jewish-Polish unions. The PPS even opposes the use of Yiddish at workers' demonstrations. Not surprising in that atmosphere that the PPS should become so nationalist in this context of extreme nationalism and political discourse. And besides, anti-Semitic Poland, the PPS might have feared an alliance with the Bund would be perceived as cooperation with anti-Polish elements. There were actually some within the Bund on its left that opposed close cooperation with the PPS. They regarded the PPS as reformist, as opportunist, and therefore unsuitable as sort of partners in the revolutionary struggle. But most moderates, I say moderate, Bund moderates, they pushed for an alliance. There's no other option, right? But it was unsuccessful. Occasional cooperation, but no Polish-Jewish proletariat unity ever emerges. They could never have opposed the entrenched forces of the right anyway, but it never succeeds in forming that brotherhood. Neither Zionists, nor the Aguda, nor the Bund were ultimately effective in securing a Jewish place in Poland. The Bundists failed to unite with Polish socialists. The Zionists and the Aguda failed to prevent anti-Semitic policies of the government in their methods. None of these strategies really worked in securing Jewish equality or Jewish economic stability in Poland. And it may be that the only real option was to leave, something which became impossible, though, by the late 30s because of immigration restrictions, especially to America, and after 36, they were restricted from immigrating to Palestine. The real importance of these parties may have been their efforts within the Jewish communities. Recall how each one of these parties became a complete world for its members, especially its young members. Especially important for the Bund, which had no power in the 20s and early 30s, but hoped at least to build power through domination of Jewish working class culture. The National Minority Rights Treatise and the provisions in the Constitution gives minorities rights to run schools in the vernacular with their own curriculum. Schools were supposed to be state-sponsored, state-supported. This doesn't happen, but an independent school system is created nonetheless. So, for example, the Tzisho system, the Yiddish Bund system created by the Bund, has 24,000 students at its best year, 1929-30. It's best in the Kresy, in the eastern borderlands, doesn't ever make it into Galicia. The Zionists established their own Hebrew language system, the Tarbut system. 47,000 students at their height in 36-37, also especially strong in the Kresy, in the eastern borderlands. The Aguda, at their height in 36-37, has 76,000 students in their system, separate for boys and girls, plus there are another 16,000 in the religious Zionist Yavne system. And these schools are successful in promoting their language of instruction, Yiddish or Hebrew, and in the case of the Zionists and the Bundists, giving this mixed Jewish secular curriculum and creating particular types of Jewish identities. But their graduates couldn't enter university. And maybe that's the reason that at that same year, 355,000 Jewish students, over two-thirds of Polish Jewish youth, are in private and government schools, Polish schools, non-Jewish Polish schools. They're free. And anyway, Jews in Galicia had long been accustomed to attending these state schools. And they also give social advantages, the same way as we saw in the Soviet Union. Acculturating into Polish has major advantages in this context. These schools were sites of Polonization with no recognition of minority culture and will lead to great strides in acculturation, if not in assimilation. The only concession, sometimes government schools would close on Sabbath or Jewish holidays. That was about it. So schools are one area where we see some success, moderate success, Zionists, Bundists, and Aguda in developing their own system. There are also great strides in Jewish culture outside of education. The Soviet Union, by the 30s, was clamping down on secular Yiddish culture. And Yiddish culture in the U.S. was beginning to decline because of acculturation into English assimilation. Poland in the 30s becomes the greatest bastion of Yiddish culture in history, before or after. So, for example, the Yiddish press, there are 2 mass circulation Yiddish language dailies in Warsaw alone, Heint and Moment, and hundreds of other daily and weekly newspapers in the provinces. Also many Jewish papers in Hebrew and in Polish especially. These couldn't compete yet with the Yiddish papers, although they would have someday probably. By the way, these are all, not all, but many of these are currently scanned and available online for you to peruse and read and use for your research. Tabloids grew especially popular, although much less prominent in Yiddish than in Polish, because Polish tabloids were increasingly accessible to Jews, and because even respectable Yiddish press would serialize fiction. Journalism was key to the Yiddish writers as a livelihood. They produced serious literature on the side, but journalism was quite important. But Yiddish literature also thrived, encouraged by various organizations like the Kulturliga, because the Kulturliga coming from Ukraine, but also buttressed by a large number of Jewish public libraries, which for Jews entering the workforce in their teens provides a critical arena to continue their education. These libraries were especially important to movements like the Bund, who want to educate and politicize workers according to their model. The number of libraries and of Yiddish publications in general grows especially in the early 1920s. From 21 to 23, about 300 Yiddish books appear each year, 70% of the world market, in both original Yiddish works and also translations of world Yiddish literature. The Kulturliga, which was closed by the Soviets in Kiev in 21, very happily and very successfully transfers itself to Warsaw. By 39, Yiddishists are decrying a crisis in Yiddish literature, especially the Yiddish book industry, which is reflected in part by a crisis in the libraries themselves, economic depression, anti-Jewish government forces, omnipresence of entertainment, fiction in the Yiddish daily press, rapid linguistic assimilation of Polish Jewish youth, and so on, is creating a crisis, and we don't know what would have happened. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Next, Jewish sports organizations, incredibly successful. These began already before the First World War, especially among the Zionists. All of the nationalist movements in East Central Europe are sporting, forgive the pun, these new organizations. Zionists have their system set up. The Maccabi organization, I actually have, if you're interested, there's an article, Google my name, you'll find an article about the Zionist sports groups in Galicia before the First World War. They have the Maccabi organization. This is part of the ideology of the new Jew, strong, virile, and so on. Based on Maccabi, right? Based on the story of Hanukkah and the revolt against the Greeks. The Bund established Morgenstern, Morning Star group in 1926, although they had sports groups in major cities before that. The Bund likes sports with mass character that doesn't require a great deal of expensive equipment, or practice, right? The workers don't have a lot of time to practice. So gymnastics, hiking, swimming, that sort of thing. Not team sports so much, although they were there too because of popular demand. Generally speaking, soccer and especially boxing were seen as sort of bourgeois and too geared towards individual accomplishment. There's a very prominent role of women. Actually, women constitute about half the Morgenstern organization, and they were prominent in the Zionist Maccabi as well. Partly this is about the new Jew that they're trying to create, but also it was a link in a chain of socialist institutions designed to fulfill the working Jew's entire cultural needs. The Bund will provide you, right, cradle to grave, morning to night, all of your cultural needs, and that means also sports groups. Right, fine. And anyway, if they hadn't established these groups, those workers would have gone to the Maccabi, so they have to compete. This is a marketplace of ideas, a marketplace of institutions, a marketplace of opportunities. Next, YIVO, the Jewish Scientific Institute, founded in 1925. This is the corner-laying, the stone-laying ceremony of YIVO, the first institutional base for Jewish historiography, which it was promoting. Voluntary donations by printers of books, brochures, posters, leaflets, also Sammlers, collectors, voluntary civilians, so to speak, collecting everything they could collect and depositing it in YIVO. Questionnaires, the writing contest. You have the Junger Historiker, the young historians writing in both Yiddish and Polish, encouraging scholarship. You have 70 students earning masters in history at the University of Warsaw on topics of Polish Jewish history, many of them under the famous historian Meir Balaban, who died during the Holocaust as professor of Jewish history since 28. Also Ignacy Schipper, who died in the Holocaust as well, whose political backgrounds in Polei Zion. And a second generation of historians, Philip Friedman, Schatzky, Raphael Mahler, Emanuel Ringelblum. These, by the way, it's really remarkable, and there have been many articles published on this, or at least some. The number of Jewish historians of the interwar period, the Junger Historiker, that come out of Galicia is remarkable. And there's a reason for that. It's about the difference of Galician Jewish identity and the kind of the strength of the Haskalah there, the connection to Polishness. There's a reason for that. And it's really it's worth remembering that, again, that terrible image of the Galicianer, the ignorant coarse peasant Galicianer. It just doesn't pan out in reality. It just doesn't pan out. YIVO, by the way, is going to be transferred, obviously, during the war. After the war, comes to New York. I forget the exact year. I think 1940. And a lot of the collection is saved. A lot of it's lost. A lot of it's saved. Warsaw becomes a center of this historical activity during the interwar period. And it's quite important. Ringelblum, there's a new book on Ringelblum you can read by Sam Kassow, an award-winning book. He led the Onig Shabbos archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, collecting all these things so that people would know the history of the Warsaw Ghetto, and they buried them, and most of it was later found after the war. Yiddish theater also thrives. The Nobel laureate Singer makes his debut in Yiddish theater in Interwar Poland, the most famous modern Yiddish writer probably, later writes in English as well. Dramatic theater is of a very high caliber in cities throughout Poland. And not just Yiddish classics, also Shakespeare, Hugo, O'Neill, and others write. Yiddish theater was different from its European counterparts in a couple ways. First of all, it suffers from the same crisis of funding as all Yiddish cultural institutions, especially the economic crisis of the 30s, although putting those theaters on a shoestring starvation ration also encourages them to become the most modern and innovative theaters in the world, among the most modern and innovative theaters in the world. The audience was not primarily middle and upper class, mostly Jewish working class, and mostly of what survived from that is what's called shund, sort of pulp fiction theater, if you will. In 1931, when Warsaw's only Yiddish dramatic theater disbanded, 5 Yiddish theaters were still up staging shund. Yiddish cultural activists responded by attempting to educate the audience, some success and so on. But shund survives, and Yiddish theater in the 30s actually is among the most successful forms of Jewish culture in interwar Poland. Yiddish theater was threatened by the fact that over half of Polish Jewish children were attending those Polish public schools during this period. They are fully bilingual, and many of them prefer the Polish theater. And actually, a lot of Polish language Jewish culture also thrives, unlike before the war. And now it's nationalist in content at times. It thrives especially in the daily press, but also a lot of Polish language Jewish schools and a growing literature in Polish written by and intended for Jews. There's a Polish Jewish theater that emerges, for example, staging Polish translations of classic Yiddish hits like Ansky's The Dybbuk or Shalom Asha's God of Vengeance and others. And this was a highly controversial aspect of the culture. A lot of Yiddish cultural leaders really hated this, especially those who are involved in struggling Yiddish theater. That why are you translating these things, producing these things in Polish? You should be doing these things in Yiddish. Some Poles welcomed this sort of Jewish integration, but many blasted this project as a Jewish pollution of Polish culture. There's also, by the way, a great film, a rich film history in Yiddish, both in Poland and, of course, in the United States. I have to tell this is one of the most famous movies, but my favorite movie of the time is probably The Shadchan. There's an absolutely incredible scene. This is a movie called The Matchmaker, about a guy who is matching poor Jewish brides in Eastern Europe with wealthy or better-to-do Jewish men in America. And there's a wonderful scene where he's sort of herding these Jewish women in their wedding gowns, already in their wedding gowns, herding them onto cattle cars, shoving them in, sealing the door, and then a crane picks up the cattle car, puts it on a boat, and they're off to America. This is in the late 30s, and this was considered to be absolutely hysterical. I mean, just so funny, because the idea of herding human beings into a cattle car was considered so ridiculous and over the top, it was considered hysterical. It's remarkable, actually, to think about that. That was just a few years before the Holocaust. That was considered to be hysterical. But there's not just that movie. There's many, many movies worth watching. These have all been preserved. And finally, there's a Jewish role in Polish culture, which is very prominent, increasingly so. Only in Hungary, and of course Soviet Union, did Jews penetrate so deeply into the cultural life of the majority nationality. Elsewhere, of course, the Jews hadn't been acculturated. Like, in Lithuania, Jews were not integrated into Lithuanian language and culture. Here in Poland, they were. And some Poles decried this as part of the takeover of Poland by the Jews. But it's really important to highlight the number of great Polish cultural figures of Jewish origin as a part of the incredible tragedy. They were an inextricable part of Polish life. All in all, considering the role of Polonization on the one hand and the continued cultural conservatism on the other, highlighted by the dominance of Aguda schools over both Tarbut and Sisho combined, one has to wonder about the entire project of secular national Jewish culture in the diaspora. Had the Holocaust not happened, this is a dangerous game, but just to think about for a moment, had the Holocaust not happened, had independent Poland survived another 20, 30, 40 years, Yiddish and Hebrew schools and culture may have inevitably declined. It may have been replaced by Jewish cultural creativity in Polish, the same way as it happened in the United States. We'll never know, but that might have happened. Many scholars think that would have happened. And finally, in the 1930s, just a brief word on what happens then. Poland's non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in 1934, they're apparently more afraid of Stalin than of Hitler, and they unilaterally renounce all obligations of the minority treaties, which they've been ignoring anyway since the beginning. The National Democrats are now called the National Party, and they are fighting against the National Radical camp. It's sometimes called the Polish Hitlerites, right? And anti-Jewish violence increases. Ghetto benches, other attacks at the university, anti-Jewish legislation like the ban on kosher meat, an economic campaign against increasingly already pauperized Jews enforced with violence. Many of these things happening already, but now supported openly by the government. Poland basically becomes second only to Germany in organized anti-Semitism. It becomes a respectable issue in mainstream national life. Maybe for some, the foremost issue in their political discourse. The struggle was between, you could say, the moderate right and the radical right, or maybe you should say better, the radical right and the really radical right. And the kernels are threatened by this extreme radical right, and each side is trying to win popular support by outdoing the other in its anti-Jewish campaign. All of this backed by the church, which had long supported the National Democrats anyway. Of course, the church and the government, at least technically, opposed violence and technically opposed racism, the church anyway, but the radical right had no such problems. The left generally remained opposed to anti-Semitism, but it was too weak to help effectively, and that wasn't its issue, that wasn't its campaign. How did the various Jewish parties cope with this? Well, if the short-run goal of the government was reducing the Jewish role in the economy and other sectors of Polish life, the long-term goal was emigration. Poland was consistently encouraging Jews to leave, especially during these years. Between 21 and 37, 400,000 Jews do leave. Where could they go? In 1924, the Johnson Act basically blocks America. Palestine is restricted, especially increasingly so over the course of these 2 decades, especially in the 30s. There's actually a whole wave of Aliyah, the fourth Aliyah, so-called fourth Aliyah from 24 to 26. It's called sometimes the Aliyah of Grabski, who is a Polish leader who was trying to exclude the Jews from national economy. 32,000 Jews leave during those 2 years from Poland, and thanks to him, in a matter of speaking. It's a kind of a funny thing. If you go to Poland in the 1920s and you see a clubhouse and it says Żydów do Palestina, Jews to Palestine, you're not quite sure, is this an anti-Semitic clubhouse or is this a Zionist one? Because in this sense, they shared that goal in a kind of creepy way. Middle-class Jews were screwed by this new tax structure of Grabski, and they flee to Palestine. Zionists are also going to encourage immigration to Palestine. They can create institutional network to support it, to prepare them, the Hachsharad network, and they're going to work with the anti-Semitic government to facilitate immigration. The Bund, on the other hand, opposes immigration, right? They assert the right to lead a Jewish life, and this stand will gain them votes and popularity in the 30s. Politics of despair, right? We can't leave. We have to stay. So we're going to fight right here. They've been arguing that anyway. So they're going to have a new popularity. They are organized to fight the increasing violence of the mid-30s and the late 30s. And this brutalization of politics is happening everywhere in Europe, but also in Poland. Violence as a political goal. that sort of the trenches of World War I are brought back to the streets. More organized pogroms and anti-Semitic attacks. And the Bund's going to organize self-defense and legal defense units. And they're armed as much as possible, sometimes joined by Polish socialists, sometimes not, organizing national protests against anti-Semitic violence and strikes and so on. There's an increasing militarization of political life across the board. So also among the Zionists, Jabotinsky's revisionism is going to recapture a lot of political energy and grow in popularity quite quickly. So the Bund and the communists and the revisionists gain ground, while the moderate Zionists and the Aguda lose ground. In sum, interwar Poland serves as this laboratory for the testing of the various modern Jewish approaches to the Jewish question. In particular, never before had the conditions been so favorable for the flourishing of national Jewish politics and culture in the diaspora, and never will it happen again. Modern Jewish nationalism in its Zionist and anti-Zionist forms won a mass following and succeeded in creating a vibrant Jewish national cultural life in Poland, but it also failed. Their great expectations, excited by Balfour, remain unfulfilled. The Bund has only mixed success in forging an alliance with the Polish left, none in improving the conditions of Jewish workers. The struggle of all of the parties for national extraterritorial autonomy fails. All the strategies of the new Jewish politics to combat anti-Semitism were not much more successful than the old policy of Stadt-Land. No party, none, could stem Polish Jewry's disastrous economic decline. Efforts at secular Jewish national life based on Yiddish education and culture boast the most impressive achievement, although cut short and only partially successful. Remember, the school attendance will know it was vibrant till the end, although strained by economic stresses, and probably would have continued at least for a generation or two. It was cut short in its prime, really. As for Agudas Yisrael, which hoped to preserve Polish Jewry in a sort of a pre-modern Orthodox form, pre-modern/modern Orthodox form, Polish Jewry was going in a different direction. It was a bastion of traditional Judaism, but the process of modernization, secularization, and acculturation was accelerating. More and more young Jews attended state schools, learned Polish, read newspapers, and generally entered the secular world. So again, if we're considering the comparison to the Soviet Union benefits many Jewish individuals at the cost of the destruction of Judaism and Jewishness and secular Jewish culture. Poland crushed Jewish individuals, crushed their economic life, but allows for the flourishing of Jewish politics and culture to this unprecedented and never to be repeated extent. Ultimately, you can't escape the fact that these were politics of futility, right? The Jewish experience in Poland demonstrates the futility of modern Jewish politics at that time and the great danger of the new nation state in East Central Europe. The longing for the golden age of Franz Josef, boy, that is going to grow not just after the Holocaust, but during the interwar period itself. Overwhelmed with problems, these states turned to nationalism, anti-pluralism, backed by the church at the time. The medieval Polish liberal tradition is gone. It's simply gone. And when Nazi anti-Semitism comes, it would strike a responsive chord among many in the Polish population. Poland, unlike Hungary and Romania, does not enact explicitly anti-Jewish legislation in the late 30s, and there was considerable Polish opposition to anti-Semitism at that time, but ultimately it was certainly not going to help. Jewish internal developments are equally paradigmatic of the whole region: acculturation, economic decline, political divisiveness, the failure of national autonomy and Zionism to solve the Jewish question politically, even as it gave cultural meaning to this rich Jewish life. And that brings us to the war, and we'll continue next time in our final class of this series on the Holocaust with a particular look to how East European Jews experienced it and the differences between the regions, Galicia versus the others. I'll see you then.